What do you think? How are we doing on job creation?
Well, obviously we're doing well, but it can't be viewed in a vacuum. We're not doing as well as other states.
Right.
And we're not doing as well as the nation is as a whole. And what I find interesting, one of the defining issues in the next gubernatorial election will be how well the economy is performing. And we know that governors get too much blame when the economy is sour, and they get too much credit when it's going well. I wrote something not too long ago and spoke to a number of economists and asked the question, how do you determine the governor's responsibility and credit for job creation? And the response was that there's no research, there's no peer-reviewed economic research which answers that question. Most economists feel that there are factors beyond a state that have much more to do with job creation than the governor. And they also feel that if you want to understand what the governor's policies and programs were, you have to wait some period of time. We talked before about the Research Triangle in North Carolina, which is tremendously successful. 50,000 people work out there now. When it was started in 1979, there were 200 people out there working 200 jobs. 20 years later, there were 10,000 jobs. So there'll be a lot of spin. And the spin depends on what numbers you want to use and what numbers you want to believe. I get a real kick out of the governor, though. She says, well, during my administration, 17,000 jobs were created. Well, the truth of the matter is that when the governor came in office in January of 15, her economic development program wasn't passed and enacted by the legislature until June of 15.
Right.
So how can you claim credit for jobs that were created when you had no program authorized? And so we'll go through that. There'll be a good campaign, and we'll share, and we'll have some differences on the numbers and how they're calculated.
In many ways, Rhode Island economy has improved. But the confidence in the Rhode Island economy by the public is only marginally improved.
And there's one figure that demonstrates the reason, and it's not just true of Rhode Island, but I think it's exaggerated here. 31%, almost a third of the jobs that were recovered since the recession, we lost 39,000 jobs, a third of those recovered pay less than 45% of the annual average statewide wage.
Yeah, that's
and that's, you don't have confidence. What the state is experiencing, and it's not just the number of jobs that are created, it's where the jobs are being created, who's filling those jobs, what you're doing to support people to get those jobs. And there's no denying by looking at the data, and I think the administration would recognize this problem, is there's a hollowing out of the middle class. And it strikes me that the most strategically important thing we can do in economic development is to come up with programs that do the opposite. Don't fight the hollowing out of the middle class. We need a middle class economic development program, not an economic development program that's based on tax incentives for rich guys to build buildings.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about that. He said some of these things will create some significant employment opportunities. We pushed back a little bit on how many incentives does a project need, and many of these projects have historic tax credits, rebuild money, a TIF, and a tax stabilization.
If I was a developer, there's no way I could lose money by coming to Rhode Island because you're going to pay for it. If the markets don't materialize, I'll just give it back to you. No, that's the question. And we sometimes get into the argument of an ideological argument, what government's role is. Well, in having that argument, you have to recognize that Rhode Island is not an island. There are 41 other states we compete with, and sometimes you need government support to encourage economic development, but it can't be the standard operating procedure. And the problem I have here, and the problem I have with tax stabilization agreements in Providence, is they become the standard operating procedure of doing business, when tax incentives should be used strategically, they should be used rarely, they should be used when they can make a difference because your competition is using them. To give out tax incentives to build 4 hotels and all these office buildings may or may not result in more jobs. And one of the principal things which any economist will tell you, because what happens in any state is more driven by what's happening in the national economy, and a whole bunch of economic factors. What happens when we finish building these buildings and say the economy is still going strong, then jobs probably will fill those buildings.
Yeah.
What happens if the economic cycle changes? What happens to those buildings then? What happens to vacant properties that we have right now? Who fills the 4 hotels? And that's the problem, and that's the heart of the argument between those of us who say if government's going to pick winners and losers, be much more conservative,
Yeah.
much more prudent in doing it, and not making it the core celeb of how you do economic development.
Talk a little bit, let's go to Washington. The President of the United States appears to have marginalized himself more so than certainly anything in my lifetime. I don't know that I've seen, other than who was the one head of Ways and Means who jumped in the fountain with
Wilbur Mills.
Wilbur Mills. I think honestly, Wilbur Mills is probably the biggest analogy of a powerful person by office becoming a non-factor.
Yeah, but he had a drinking problem.
He had a drinking problem, and he was with Fannie Fox, I believe was her name.
What's her name?
Yeah, and it's maybe Bob Packwood, but by then I don't think he was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee anymore. But we've hit a scenario. Where does the leadership come from? Is Paul Ryan's got a community meeting broadcast live on CNN? Is that an attempt by him to sort of say we're going to leave the president behind? I'm going to help drive the dialogue, and we're going to get some things done.
In our system of government, the legislature can't leave the president behind, and the president can't ignore the legislature. And that goes for Democrats and Republicans. Democrats need Donald Trump to be an effective president so they can get part of their agenda accomplished as much as Republicans do. It has to come from leadership. The president has to be obviously more careful of how and what he says. If you were referring to what happened in Charlottesville, that was unconscionable.
Yeah.
There's no place, which Paul Ryan and other Republicans have said, for the Nazis or for the Ku Klux Klan.
It's remarkable.
Yeah, Jeff Sessions had it right. Jeff Sessions, I think, has been a pretty good attorney general. I know people around here don't agree with some of his policies, but he basically called out the Nazis and the KKK and said the Justice Department would do a civil rights investigation. I can't wait for that civil rights investigation, because after you get past the obvious thing of not tolerating hatred, and that's not tolerable in our society, nor should it be, what role do the Charlottesville police play? What really happened there? And you have to step back and do that in the cool, sun of day. So we'll see. But I think to answer your question, I've spoken around it, is communications. You're in the communications business is critically important, and the president gets himself knocked off message by saying things that are not, well thought out. And so leadership starts with communicating, and he's going to have to do a heck of a lot of a better job communicating, with the people and with the Congress.
Listen, I think the 2 epiphany moments of Charlottesville were done by new models of media, Vice's embedded reporter who really unveiled the real core of who was there and what they meant. They seemed to be the only ones capturing on video. And then ProPublica, we ran both pieces. ProPublica had an analysis by one of their editors who was on both days, who said the police were standing around, pretty clearly standing around, in a very, very different approach to separation, which is usually the strategy when you have 2 opposing forces coming in, where the police create the barrier between the 2 groups from meeting.
I look at how the police in Boston conducted themselves and their leadership versus Charlottesville. And, when we got into the issues during President Obama's administration of these incidents with police, and the immediate language was to blame the police. And sometimes they did deserve blame. Certainly, not all police are angels. You create a situation where you make it much more difficult for the average cop and the average leadership of police departments to do what they've been trained to do for decades. And inaction leads to indecision. Indecision leads to a vacuum. A vacuum leads to some very unsavory people filling it.
Let's go back to the state budget. Budget's passed. The governor, as part of that budget, had to find $25 million in savings. Where's she going to find that? She's got some very significant hotbed issues, both at DCYF and UHIP. Both those issues are bubbling up and continue to plague.
This is probably one of the worst budgets from a fiscal standpoint
Yeah.
that I've seen in some time.
Have you ever seen a budget that said you cut 25 million?
Oh, I've seen that, but I also haven't seen a budget at the same time that had about another 55 or 60 million in one-time revenues.
Savings.
So you have a situation where you have 80 or 90 million dollars that are composed of one-time revenue items, plus phantom cuts in spending.
Yeah.
That's going to drive up out-year deficits. It's going to make it more difficult to invest in the future unless the economy really heats up more than we think it's going to heat up. And, the governor, it's not a peep out of the governor's office. What I find absolutely amazing about this is that $25 million of phantom money, $12.5 million in one-time amnesty tax money, $29 million in scoops from quasi-independent agencies, including the Renewable Energy, Fund, and 2 weeks later, the governor's standing up promoting her great record on renewable energy. Well, how the heck can you do that and start stealing their money and scooping their money? And so the budget was really built on sand. The budget this year, the budget we're in right now, has about a $45 or $50 million structural deficit, and by that I mean current spending exceeds current revenues by about $50 million.
Yeah.
And so that's very disturbing. It was quite telling that the McCantus Center at George Mason University put out their fiscal soundness report, and it found Rhode Island below average. We ranked 38th in fiscal soundness, and when you look at debt, you look at unfunded liabilities, you look at local pensions, you look at passing a budget that really is not a balanced budget, you scratch your head, and no one, this is much more abstract, but I think it's really important. You never hear this being discussed by anybody in the administration. You could be the greatest economic development governor, you could have the most generous economic development programs, but unless you're operating a fiscally sound state, business is going to look away.
Yeah,
and I think conservative, which just reflects my bias, but conservative fiscal policy is very important as part of an economic development strategy, and there's no way you can define the budget that was passed as being fiscally conservative. It has some good things in it. Every budget has some good things. You and I have discussed this before, but the auto tax cut was a positive development. I'm sure we could find other positive things in the budget. So the budget as a document is such a voluminous document. You can't say it hasn't got items that are positive and that'll be helpful, but it's the overall budget is not a fiscally sound document.
Let me ask you one last question before you go. Rhode Island's real estate, residential real estate, is pretty red hot right now. Mm-hmm. Especially in affluent areas, east side of Providence, East Greenwich, Barrington. It's now back and beyond 2007 levels. It appears that some of the demand is coming from out of state. Mm-hmm. Can it be too hot? Should we have some worries, or is this an indicator of a good, healthy, robust economy?
No, I think by and large it's a very positive indicator, and on the job side it shows that we are creating some jobs at the top end that pay well, and some of the more affluent community residential property is attractive. The one thing I become concerned about, and I haven't looked at the data, so I can't say this with any certainty, is you need also a vigorous housing industry.
Yeah.
You need to be increasing supply.
Yeah, that's a huge problem right now. There's a record low in supply, and very few new housing starts.
And so that's the question. If the market is hot,
yeah,
why aren't more residential developers sticking their toe in the water and providing for the demand? And that's so you look at things long run. We have a kind of economy here that follows cycles. Stock market is doing well. We are creating some jobs at the very upper end in management and some of the science areas. So we're doing better in attracting, people that require that kind of housing. But if you're not building supply, then it's very cyclical.
Yeah.
And that's an important part. And it's also an important question, if you are creating supply, then there are people working, there are construction work going on that is not kind of being hand-fed by government. It's meeting real market demand. And I don't know why that's not happening, but that's something I'd be very concerned about.
Yeah, it's a distressing little indicator. I want to thank you, the Money Man. Always,
pleasure.
Mondays are always a great day here at Go Local. Appreciate all your insights. Clearly, if you heard his comments, he listens to you every Monday. He, meaning Secretary Pryor.
Then you want to give them multiple choice.
Yeah. And appreciate it very much. Welcome to the political season. We'll see you back next Monday. And have a great week. And glad you did not stare into the sun and were blinded
Oh, no,
by the eclipse.
No, I have enough trouble seeing things straight.